lab group has also helped to define some new mouse lemur species, some little awfully cute things you can hold in your hand and little creatures. But of course, they're part of a range of species who are being impacted by global change and human anthropogenic change in the island itself. And so that'll be the focus of her presentation today. Aside from that, I came to know her work through some of the early genetics on prosimians, and back in the bad old days before next generation sequencing, but now in fact she's using those kinds of tools to try to define genomic variation in these species and to give us better understanding of both the evolution of primates, but perhaps also some new insights into diseases that commonly affect humans. So with this introduction, I'd like to introduce Dr. Yoder, and she'll speak again about the biodiversity crisis in Madagascar, causes, consequences, and glimmers of hope. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks very much to Tad you wrote one of the most enticing invitations to participate in this colloquium that I just could not resist because I'm sort of overscheduled this fall, but he was very persuasive, and it just sounded like such an interesting theme that you've settled on, looking at extinction from lots of different angles, and I thought, well, I just cannot say no to that. So thank you for the invitation, and thanks to Elizabeth for helping organize my stay. So with that, I'll get started. So I also want to just say that this is sort of an unusual talk for me to give, in that I'm not really going to talk particularly about the genetic research. I'm not really hardly at all going to talk about the genetic research, genomic research that we're doing in my lab. But this is sort of more, I know I'm speaking to a four-field group here, so I wanted to try to touch a little bit at least on all of the four fields, and bring that to bear on our understanding of what's going on in Madagascar and what has been going on and what is likely to go on in Madagascar. So with that, I'll just go ahead and get started. So, Madagascar. So if we look at the Earth's land surface area, we see that we all know there's more water than land, but still there's a heck of a lot of land. And if you measure that, it's about 510 million square kilometers altogether. Now, if we zoom in on Madagascar, which is off the coast of East Africa, we see that it is only 587,000 and change square kilometers, so much smaller than the land surface area of the Earth. In fact, if you do the back of the envelope calculation, you find out that Madagascar is 0.01% of Earth's land surface area, so just a tiny little smidgen of land in the context of the whole planet. Another thing that we can say about Madagascar is that it is an island. It's not touching another landmass. The closest landmass is East Africa, and that is about 400 kilometers east to west distance, and it's separated by a very deep oceanic rift, the Mozambique Channel. So one of the questions that I want to know is, how long has that been the situation? And it's something that I learned as a graduate student that was just pounded into my head. And, so for the graduate students out there, it's very dangerous always to take what you see happening now and apply that to the past. So it's always better to try to understand the present in the context of the past, as in my worldview. So let's try to do that. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through an animation that is the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea. And just to get you oriented, I'm going to walk away from the microphone for a second. So if you look up at the top, that's a time ticker. It's set at 200 million years before present. And so this is all of Pangaea that we're looking at. And what the animation is going to do is we're going to move closer and closer to the present and watch Pangaea break up. And before we do that, I want to get you oriented in what you're seeing. So this is North America. All of these island bits are Asia, what is going to become Asia. If we look here, this is South America. Here is Africa. Here's Antarctica, Australia, India. And this, for the next 4 minutes, is the most important place on the planet. This is the island of Madagascar. So we're going to, I know you all have different geographic interests, so you might be looking up at Asia or South America, but let's focus on Madagascar for just a minute. So there's Madagascar. And I'm going to get it going, and then I'll get back over and gesticulate wildly as we watch it unfold. Okay, so you see our time ticker is moving closer to the present. Things are starting to sort of rotate sort of to the east and to the north. And right around 180 million years ago, one of the first things we see is the separation of what's going to be called Laurasia and Gondwana. So Gondwana being the southern continent. Well, almost coincident with that major break, you see that Madagascar starts to separate from Africa and slide south. And it remains connected to India for a long time. So it's just sliding until about 130 billion years ago. And this is when it starts to separate from Africa. And they never touch again, at least not in our lifetimes. It stays connected to India for a pretty good while, about 30 million years, and forms the Indo-Madagascar subcontinent. You see Antarctica sliding down, Australia moving off to the east, and then we're going to, just sort of bide our time until we get to right around 88 million years ago, and at that point, India separates from Madagascar, just leaving it behind, basically. And this is why we call this the Indian Ocean, because you're going to watch over the course of several tens of millions of years as India traverses the Indian Ocean, and it's going to hit this Balkan, or these hotspots, and scoot across the Indian Ocean. And then right at about the beginning of the Eocene, 50 million years ago or so, it starts its collision with Asia. And this is what's building the Himalayas, et cetera, and we've had very recent history where this is still a very active seismic area. But the point here, South America has been doing all kinds of cool stuff, basically being an island continent for tens of millions of years. But the point that I want to make here is that from the time that India separated from Madagascar 88 million years ago, Madagascar has been all alone in the middle of the Indian Ocean, with the closest landmass being Africa. And you can see that this is a very deep rift here. So sea levels have really not mattered much. And in fact, I believe sea levels are about as low right now as they've been in the entire history of what you've just seen. So you can put that sort of in your thinking caps while we're moving forward. So anyway, that's the history of Madagascar. Long, long isolation. What else is interesting about Madagascar? Well, it is environmentally incredibly heterogeneous. So people often ask me, what's Madagascar like? And I say, well, you'll have to be a little more specific. What part of Madagascar are you talking about? And I'm not going to walk through this particularly, but all the different colors illustrate different climatic regimes, different ecosystems, different habitats. So you can see that it's quite a mosaic of habitats. One aspect of that, at least theoretically, although it's been very difficult to make one-to-one correlations, is that all of these things have seemed to come together to make Madagascar into something of a speciation laboratory, if you will. So and this is pretty well known, that to be an organism in Madagascar usually means you are specific to Madagascar. That is to say, levels of endemism are incredibly high. Also, there's a depauperate representation of various groups, like vertebrates and mammals, so that there are only certain representatives of these different groups in Madagascar. But when you get there, you tend to diversify. So you're highly endemic and you're also highly diverse. And this is true in this, so I've got some lemurs and tenrecs, which are these funky insectivorous creatures, which are actually Afrotherians. So they're more closely related to elephants than they are to shrews, which they look like. And I have a friend who says it looks like James Brown, this one. And we have carnivores, bats, fantastic array of lizards, crazy-looking rodents. This one is sort of is convergent on rabbits. So it's just it's a wild place. It's a lot of fun to be a field biologist in Madagascar. Now, so let's get to, so this, what I'm trying to do is raise awareness of the value of Madagascar as a biodiversity hotspot, and certainly, I think that's pretty well known, so, but I, of course, have to drive it home. So the world's 4th largest island in the world, which is still just 0.01% of Earth's land surface area, is home to 5% of all plant and animal species. So that's crazy. And these data are, this was taken from the World Wildlife Fund website, so just so you know. But one thing that I do know is that it's home to almost 20% of the living primate species on Earth. So 20% approximately of living primate species are found on this tiny little postage stamp that's about the size of the state of California. So that's a crazy observation, and once I realized that as a sort of young biologist, that's when I became hooked on Madagascar and on lemurs, and I just, I've spent my career trying to figure out why that is. And another thing that's quite notorious is that lemurs are highly endangered. So they, by the IUCN, they've been designated as the most endangered vertebrates on Earth. And this was back in 2012. And the reasoning here was that every species in Madagascar, every lemur species, is either threatened or near threatened, or extinct or near extinct. So they're all in these highly elevated categories of risk. Now, how about their history? One thing, and this was what I did as a graduate student, was I wanted to understand their evolutionary history. How many times had they gotten to Madagascar, and when did they get to Madagascar? So to make a 6-year-long story short, my determination was that it was a single origin of lemurs. So they're a clade of primates, and they are all each other's closest living relatives. And next to them are the lorises, and so the slow lorises and bush babies of Africa and Asia. So the most parsimonious explanation is that they arrived once and only once. Another question that I had, and this was sort of my postdoctoral into assistant professor life, was to try to figure out when this might have happened. And so just to kind of walk through this, so I use molecular phylogenetic techniques to try to estimate actual geological ages of divergence events. And it's, an entire seminar, actually an entire course in itself, but just the basics of it is that you use the shape of the tree and you estimate the branch lengths and you calibrate your tree with, a fossil date or some, geological event to turn rate into time. And then you can, I'm going to walk away from the microphone. So let's say area 1 is Africa, just, pulling something out of my hat, and let's call area 2 Madagascar. So we know that other primates are in Africa, and only one group of primates is in Madagascar. So we estimate then that there was just this single colonization, and if we can put an age on this node and on this node, then we can constrain when that colonization would have occurred. And given what we know about population genetics and ecology and all of it, usually when you get into a new environment, if you're a new colonizer, that's when you're going to diversify. So typically, people or investigators call this the age of the node. Of course, I always like to emphasize that it could have been anywhere along this branch, but this is the only one that we can actually measure. So this is a minimum age estimate of the radiation of the lemurs. So if we can put an age on that, then we know a minimum age of when lemurs would have gotten to Madagascar. I just said all these things. So cutting right to the chase, we have estimated that the initial radiation of lemurs, that is to say the separation of the ii from all of the other lemurs, that lineage, is about 60 million years ago. I'm actively re-involved in this kind of work using genomic scale data, as Tad suggested. So these, we have much bigger data sets to deal with now. The problem is that the theory and the computer science that goes into dealing with these huge data sets makes it not easier but more difficult, in fact, to get good age estimates out. So I think this might be a little bit old, but let's just say it's around 60 million years old. Well, there's something special about that age. I think almost everyone in this, I'm sure everyone in this room knows about the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary, or the KPG, when a giant asteroid hit the planet, and this was about precisely 65 million years ago. There was an asteroid that's called Chicxulub, or the Devil's Tail, and it slammed into what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, and the data are just incontrovertible that this event occurred. The downstream effects of this event are up for discussion and debate, but the fact of it is that this asteroid slammed into the Earth at this time. But I think pretty much everyone agrees that all hell broke loose after this impact, and just what exactly the all hell breaking loose consequences on the biota are or were, that is what, you know, lots of papers are written about, and debate still goes on. Now, one of the more sort of doomsday scenarios is that when the meteor made impact, it superheated the atmosphere, and that there would have been these wildfires atmospherically, and because of the rotation of the Earth, that these wildfires would have spread around the planet fairly quickly. And if you look down here in the corner, you'll see a time stamp. So this is putatively 2.5 hours after the impact. And if true, these atmospheric wildfires would have swept over Madagascar, and Madagascar, being an island, would have been very vulnerable to these wildfires. Big continents like Africa, you know, biota would have been wiped out in various parts, but there would have been other pockets where, you know, there could have been recolonization. If you're an island, you're going to be much more vulnerable. So this is the, you know, spread of these wildfires and the impact. Okay, so potentially then, according to this doomsday scenario at least, at the KPG, Madagascar might have had its slate sort of wiped clean. And certainly, and again, this is almost another entire seminar, the fossil record compared to what we see in the extant record are incredibly different. So something happened, and so, I mean, there were dinosaurs, and there were all these funky mammals, there were metatherians, there were gondwanatheres, there are all these strange mammals that are gone, and there are now placental mammals in their place, and this is true also of plants and you know, reptiles, and, you know, so there, you know, so there's a there for sure. Now, another aspect is, so we're talking about 60 million years ago for lemurs diversifying in Madagascar and presumably arriving, you know, shortly before that. What did the planet look like? So this was 62 million years ago. As you saw with the animation, India was already cleared out of the way, so Madagascar was left behind, and, you know, Africa, it's, you know, separated from Africa and has been for a long time, so it was an island, certainly, at the time that lemurs colonized Madagascar. I think we can be pretty certain of that. So how would lemurs have gotten there? Well, this is, believe it or not, this is the best scientific explanation that we have for lemurs having arrived in Madagascar. Now, I doubt they had a boat or paddles, and this I just have to acknowledge Stephen Nash, who is a wonderful illustrator. He works with Conservation International, and he's at SUNY Stony Brook, and he does these wonderful illustrations of wonderful artists, but this is a little fanciful, as you will agree. But anyway, you know, this is a hypothesis that I certainly hold to be true, that they somehow made an overwater crossing from Africa to Madagascar to colonize Madagascar. Now, how would they have done that? Well, does anybody see the mammal in this picture? So this This was, I'll show you in a minute, but this is a lemur. This is a dwarf lemur hibernating underground. And this is, I want to acknowledge Marina Blanco, who you'll see a picture of in just a minute, who's done all this wonderful work. So mouse lemurs and dwarf lemurs torpor or hibernate for long periods of time each year, particularly the dwarf lemur. So one of the hypotheses out there, and there have been several papers written about this, is that if you had a group of lemurs swept out to sea on a chunk of land that was ripped off of the shores of Africa, and in fact this does happen now during storms. You can look out in the Mozambique Channel and see these floating islands with trees standing and so on. So if this had happened and you had a little primate that was able to then just kind of crash and go out and hibernate, then it would have been easy to do. So this is sort of out there in the literature. But here is Marina having dug up this sleeping lemur. This is just an amazing phenomenon. So these dwarf lemurs, and this is another seminar, but these animals hibernate for 6 to 8 months of the year, and the ones in the east actually dig underground to do so. So it's really just quite fascinating. Okay, so that is, in a nutshell, the sort of history, the historical biogeography and evolutionary history of lemurs, and that's all you're going to hear from me on that subject today. So now let's talk about this evil brew that we are dealing with that is endangering these animals. And it's not, I just want to go ahead and say it right now, there are no specific bad guys that you can point to, so it's not down with people, up with lemurs. Certainly, as an undergraduate, that was my sort of attitude about conservation biology and lemurs and so on. And then all it took was one trip to Madagascar and spending, I guess it was about a month and a half, my first trip there, and working with Malagasy colleagues and students, and I was like, oh my God, you guys are great. Up with Malagasy, down with lemur. No, it didn't get that bad. But let's just say my attitudes have been refined quite considerably. So what I wanted to present to you, and I am happy to be corrected. I was just telling Elizabeth, if you know more about this, by all means speak up during the question period. But the sort of the accepted wisdom of the colonization history of Madagascar for humans is that it was very, very recent. So it's one of the most recently colonized regions on the planet by humans. And oddly, it seems almost certain that the original colonizers, the original human colonizers, came from Indonesia, not from Africa, and that it was approximately 2,000 years ago. So that would have been the first wave of human migration. The second wave, these are high, strong generalizations, but the second wave was approximately 1,000 years ago from North Africa, and in fact there is a strong Muslim culture and population in Madagascar, and it was only very recently, around 500 years ago, that sub-Saharan Africans colonized Madagascar. And this all makes sense, really. So fisher people from Indonesia would have been out to sea. Sub-Saharan Africans would have, there was no reason for them to go out to sea and explore. So this all makes a lot of sense. So this is the sort of, cliff notes of how humans came to colonize Madagascar. Well, since they arrived, some bad things have been happening to the biodiversity of Madagascar. What you're seeing right now are skulls of what we call subfossil lemurs or giant lemurs. There was a megafaunal presence in Madagascar that is no longer there. And the extinction window, as far as we can tell, began around 2,000 years ago. So it seems to be a bit of a smoking gun that these megafaunal creatures started to disappear right around the time that humans arrived. So I'm not going to identify all of these for you, but I will tell you that this skull in life is about that big. So these were big animals. So there were about 16 species, and they all started to go extinct within the past 2,000 years. I will tell you also, this guy right here, Archeo lemur, which for all the world looks like a baboon or something. It's a quadrupedal primate. There are specimens that are as recent as 500 or 600 years old. So they were very, very recent extinction. So it was a long extinction window, seemingly subsequent to the arrival of humans. And here is Steve Nash again, his beautiful rendition of some of these animals. So this is Archeo indris, which was the giant, skull that I was pointing out. This animal was about the size of a female gorilla. So, and if you, think of a female gorilla and a mouse lemur, being this big, so the size variation in the lemurs alone is just absolutely stunning for a single clade of organisms. And here's Archeo lemur looking like a nice quadrupedal monkey. So anyway, these guys are all gone. There were also elephant birds, and lots of them. So that this is the Google provides so many great things for talks. I was Googling like crazy last night on elephant birds and so on. So this one I found. But just to give you a sense of how big these birds were, so these were ratites. This is, like a 6 foot tall man, and this is how big that bird was. And we know that they were everywhere, and I've seen their bones. I've done oddly quite a bit of sort of archaeology and recent Holocene paleontology, and you can start digging in sites where you're going to find these subfossils, and we're always looking for the primates, but what we find are the elephant birds and the pygmy hippos, which I'll show you in a minute. But you just find they're everywhere. I mean, there were so many of these birds, and their eggs. Some of you probably have seen photographs of people with the eggs. They were this big, and you can walk around. And I mean, I'm a terrible paleontologist. I can't find anything. But you walk along and there are big, chunks of shell lying around. So clearly there were a lot of these birds around, and they are all gone. Believe me, we would see them if they were still around. And there were also pygmy hippos, and they are gone. These guys are estimated to have arrived much more recently and went to extinction much more recently. And in fact, if you go into villages, and this is a little ethno-cultural anthropology, I've worked with David Burney, who's very interested in the megafaunal extinction in Madagascar. And what he likes to do is to go into villages in Madagascar and find the oldest person. He'll say, who is the oldest person in the village? And he will say, tell me about animals that you used to see when you were young that you don't see anymore. And many places in Madagascar, he's heard basically the same story, and there's a name for it, the Siambi-yumbi, which means the not cow cow. So these are at least apocryphal or handed down. So in historical memory, there were pygmy hippos, and they're all gone. Now, so I've given you this whole story about humans arriving, everything goes to hell, the big animals go extinct, and this is, humans being the bad guys, as is so typical of our storytelling about what's going on with the planet. And, let's admit it, there is a lot of truth to it. But I was just talking to Elizabeth about this. Bob Dewar, who was an anthropologist, archaeologist at Yale University, also married to Allison Richard, for those of you who know her. Just right before he died in 2013, he published a paper in PNAS where they have found stone tools that were some 2,000 years older than the 2,000-year accepted wisdom for the first colonization of Madagascar. So I think that the colonization history for humans is much more complicated than we recognize, and there's still a lot of work to be done there. But I want to read a nice quote from that paper. Our unique evidence shows that extinctions occurred long after human arrival on the island. Although human activities were involved, including hunting, the specific causes and pattern remain to be determined. More generally, the view that Madagascar's history can be sharply divided by the arrival of humans between an undisturbed Eden and anthropogenic chaos is no longer tenable. And I think this is a really important message, and it is not my, so don't ask me too many questions about it because I won't be able to answer them, but I believe that the consensus view right now about at least the megafaunal extinctions is that climate change was already having an impact on the survival of these giant creatures, and that the environment was sort of drying and cooling, and so the forests were much more restricted than it wasn't this forest stem to stern kind of environment that we've all envisioned, and humans arrive and slash and burn, and the creatures disappear. So the idea is that they were sort of already kind of on the edge of existence, and that humans were kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and that it wasn't an extreme, purposeful kind of hunting like we get in North America, the megafaunal extinction, that it was much more subtle and multifactorial. So with that, I'll move on. Okay, but let's just wrap this part up and say the biodiversity of Madagascar it's not just me. I think most biologists would agree there's something very special about the diversity and the endemism in Madagascar, and that what we know, based on a whole suite of interdisciplinary approaches, is that lemurs and other Malagasy endemics are unique evolutionary experiments. They got there accidentally. There's been a long, long period of evolutionary history to generate the diversity that we see today, and that is already disappearing, and so that it's irreplaceable. So there is very strong conservation value to the biodiversity of Madagascar because of this long history and their great diversity. And let me tell you, we can't afford another 60 million years to let the biodiversity of Madagascar come back, or certainly it won't matter to us. So, as I've already said to you, lemurs and other Malagasy plants and animals are highly endangered, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Again, just to focus on the lemurs, repeating myself, 91% of Madagascar's lemurs were threatened with extinction, and this was made quite public in 2012 after the IUCN Congress. Now, so the current state of affairs, and this again is subject for debate, if we consider that Madagascar was forested stem to stern, then we would conclude that only about 10% of the natural vegetation survives. I'm not sure that that's entirely accurate, but let's say only 20%, pre-human arrival. So this is, satellite imagery. So you can see that the forest is restricted to the coastal areas, and the central part of the island is just grassland, and it's anthropogenic grassland. So there's slash and burn agriculture, and you see this everywhere. So, and particularly prior to the planting season in Madagascar, you can drive around and you just see, at night especially, you just see fires everywhere. And, at that time of year, it's like the island's on fire and there's smoke in the air. It's very, very vivid. There's also a lot of sort of pastoral cultures in Madagascar, and these are zebu. They're oxen that are highly valued by the Malagasy people. So the more zebu you have, the richer you are. And it seems to me that they don't do, this is my naive impression, but it seems like they don't really do much with these cattle other than, or oxen, other than move them around and let them eat the vegetation. Because they are so valued, you don't want to slaughter them if you don't absolutely have to. But they're very destructive to the natural environment. There's also, mining has been sort of picking up its steam in Madagascar, and there are various Chinese companies that are coming in and really not environmentally friendly. They just come in, they dig, they take, and they go, and they leave the devastation behind. There are a couple of companies that are a little more, or operations that are a little more enlightened. One, actually this photograph is taken from Anbatu V. This is a nickel mining operation, and they are doing a lot of very proactive biodiversity conservation work, with offset areas and a lot of monitoring of lemur health near the mine site and further away. And actually the Duke Lemur Center is involved with some of that environmental and health monitoring. But nonetheless, I mean, it's pretty ugly. It leaves big scars in the earth, and there's no getting around that. And the rosewood situation has become extreme, although I think it's gotten a little better thanks to all the attention that it received. But even like the good guys, Gibson Guitar was found to be culpable in exporting endangered hardwoods from Madagascar. They insist they didn't know that they were doing that, but that's a little hard to, that's a bit of a stretch. So it's very pervasive, all of these different pressures, and it's global, it's not just local. And then to get to the meat of the talk, global change and climate is real. And temperatures, on average, are getting hotter, and that's having a lot of impacts. And I'm not here to give you a talk on climate change, but just to say that, it really is something that is quite significant, and it is quite real. And if you look at just the past 30 years, you see that there's been quite a rapid escalation of global climate temperatures. So now let me just go back to the beginning of the talk where I was saying that the megafaunal extinction probably had some relationship to climate change, but that was natural climate change, and it was humans kind of disturbing the natural process just by being, an added burden on the environment and just kind of kicking things over. But that was climate change that was occurring on, sort of geological timescales. What's going on right now is happening so fast that organisms are not able to deal with it, and there are various components of our government, certain representatives who will tell you, oh, well, there's been climate change throughout Earth's history, so why's everybody so alarmed about this? And that is correct. Of course, there's been major climate change, and 30 million years ago, most of the planet was tropical. Yes, we agree, we know that. But this has occurred over geological time scales, and organisms have time to, harness the power of natural selection to evolve with the changing climate. This is happening so fast that that's not an option. So what are we going to do about it? And now I'm going to segue into the paper that I distributed to the students that we can discuss after the talk is concluded. So our goal, our meaning myself and Jason Brown, who was a postdoc in my lab, and he's a GIS specialist and just really talented, we wanted to compare the past, present, and future distributions of as many lemur species as we could and look at how that's going to change in the face of climate change and global temperatures rising. And to do that, we use species distribution modeling. And I'm just going to walk through this very quickly. It's probably something familiar to you, but just in case there's like one person out there that doesn't know about SDM, I want to explain it. So this is a species distribution model map. And what it is just like a geographic area, it doesn't matter what it is, and it's specific to a particular species. Let's call it a mouse lemur. So we're looking at the species distribution model for a particular species of mouse lemur. And so wherever you see blue, that is a part of the habitat that is unsuitable to that particular species of mouse lemur. And the hotter the color gets, the more suitable that habitat is. So when we look at this red, the red bits here,